Ms. Longbottom.
Thank you, Chair. Members, that concludes the first truth-telling hearing of this inquiry. Over the past 3 days, you have heard stories and seen photos, artefacts and artworks from 6 First Nations participants shared generously with the inquiry in relation to their lived and, in some instances, professional experiences. On the first day, the inquiry heard evidence from Aunty Leslie Williams and Professor Tracy Bunder. On day 2, David Ragg and Ruth Hegarty appeared, and today we have had the testimony of Michael Aird, Flo Watson, and finally Jackie Huggins. The issues this inquiry is tasked with examining are wide-ranging. The evidence given this week has been particularly focused on a number of themes relevant to your terms of inquiry, to which I will make reference in a moment. But at the outset, it is apt to emphasise that the golden thread of that evidence has been the strength and resilience of those subject to the, at times, horrendous past conduct of colonial and state governments, and the courage of those who have come forward this week to share their stories. Much of the evidence that you have heard during this first truth-telling hearing has related to the theme of displacement and dispossession of First Nations people in the lead up to and following the introduction of the Aboriginals Protection and Restriction on the Sale of Opium Act in 1897. You heard compelling evidence this morning from Aunty Flo Watson about the experiences of her mother who, having survived a massacre at Palmer River where her own mother and brother were killed, was then removed to Maytown before being made to walk in chains to Cooktown, a journey that took some days on their way to the mission. To similar effect was the testimony given by Jackie Huggins of her mother being taken to Cherbourg in the 1920s on a cattle truck. Her mother's 4 siblings, mother, father and grandparents were removed at the same time and then taken to separate places. They were not told where they were going. We also heard from Aunty Ruth Hegarty about her family's arrival at Cherbourg and in particular her experience as a young girl living at that reserve. Aunty Ruth was only 6 months old when her family went to Cherbourg, and her mother was then only a 19-year-old girl. Years later, her mother told her how frightened she was. And I quote from Aunty Ruthie's book. These are the words of what her mother told her. "I felt all alone. I saw my parents going in the other direction. I had no idea where they were being taken. The boys could do nothing as they watched from behind the dormitory fence. My heart ached. I thought we were like an old rag that had been torn in 3 parts. It was never to be put back together again." A singularly significant impact of the Act and the legislation that surrounded it was the removal and incarceration of First Nations people on missions and reserve. This theme was explored by a number of participants who appeared before the inquiry this week. Aunty Flo told us today about her mother's arrival at the mission at Yarrabah, where she was taken straight to the dormitory and given 1 blanket and a European name, Doris Maytown. You heard Aunty Ruth's recollection that it was so cold at Cherbourg. She recounted that the family had 1 or 2 blankets, slept in 2 single beds and covered themselves with a mattress made of coconut fibre to keep them warm. They did not have shoes or socks. Aunty Ruth spoke of the hunger and deprivation at Cherbourg, with nothing much in the pantry. Auntie Ruth also told us about her experience of being separated from her mother. She spoke about what it was like as a child, that she didn't understand why her mum had to stay separate from her while she was in the dormitories. Auntie Leslie also told us about growing up on the Cherbourg mission from age 1 until she was sent out to work as a domestic. She told us about segregation in the communities, including through the separation of the white officials area and camp area. Professor Bunda told you about her mother's life on the Perga mission. She painted a picture of the living conditions there, in the buildings, and this is in her words, that were used to incarcerate Aboriginal people. This included how her mother was always cold and hungry all the time. Professor Bunda's testimony also touched on labour at the mission. Her mother was sent out to do domestic work at around only 12 years of age, after only a few years of schooling. We have also heard about the restrictions and punishments at Cherbourg from Jackie Huggins, including that her mother Rita was told not to speak their language at the mission. This also resonated with testimony given by David Ragg. He talked about the experiences of his parents and their siblings growing up on Cherbourg and how they differed to his own. Unlike David, his parents weren't put into dormitories. You also heard from David about the interactions between different Aboriginal communities at Cherbourg and how they generally stayed together. But on the topic of the conditions at Cherbourg and the control to which people were subject, David Ragg told us that you were not allowed to speak your traditional language or practice culture at Cherbourg, and if you did, you could be sent away. As he expressed it, there was a sense of fear of the superintendent and manager who had ultimate power and could send you to what we thought was hell. Against the contrast of the evidence you heard about the life of First Nations people on reserve was the evidence you saw and heard today through the testimony of Michael Aird about the account of the ever-present fear of those who weren't in reserves, of the forced separation of children from their families, and the strategies, in his words, the tactics of survival his family and others engaged in to try to conform and show off their successes to, and I quote, gain some sort of respectability in the eyes of Europeans and keep their families together. A particularly resonant theme of those in some ways less fortunate than Michael Aird and his family who were able to stay together was the removal of children from their families. This theme was apparent in the evidence given by Professor Bunda, who told you of her mother's family stories of removal of children. We heard that in 1930, her mother was taken to Perga mission at about 6 years of age, with her auntie then aged 8 and her uncle aged 10. We also heard of the attempts by Professor Bunda's grandmother to write to the Chief Protector to get her children back, despite, in Professor Bunda's words, having no leg to stand on legally, which she aptly described as being a, and I quote, devastating record. David Ragg also shared his recollection of the day that he was taken away from his family and placed into the dormitory. As he told us, you don't necessarily remember the specific dates, but you remember what it was like to be taken from your parents, your families. He told us it's been good for me to look back at all my records which show me when I went in and when I came out. But of course, removals and incarceration in missions and reserves were just two aspects of the control exerted over First Nation peoples by colonial and state governments. Other aspects of that wide-ranging control related to the personal property and places of residence, wages, finances and employment, marriage and courtship of those under the Act. A substantive focus of the evidence this week was the control over wages. Auntie Leslie told you a powerful story about attending a debutante ball, a part of the Cherbourg show. She spoke about the significance of this event in coming out in society and for her desire to follow in the footsteps of her sister. You heard from Auntie Leslie that an outfit was ordered for her and paid by cheque from the superintendent, but later Auntie Leslie was told that there was nothing left in her account. She subsequently discovered from her records that the debutante ball outfit was paid for with money taken from her account. This came to £38, which was, at that time, more than 6 months of the wages for her work. Auntie Leslie had no idea at the time. Jackie Huggins also told the inquiry about stolen wages, about how her mother Rita received just £2 per week for her work. The rest went to the superintendent. Jackie told the inquiry that she later discovered that those stolen wages went to roads, to hospitals, but not, of course, to her mother. But those aspects of control extended far beyond just marriage. You heard today from Auntie Flo about her parents' marriage, how her mother had to line up at the mission dressed in a brown Hessian sack with no shoes, and then was told, "You will marry this fellow," and that was it. And once her mother married, she left the dormitory to stay in the mission itself. But you also were told by Auntie Flo about being sent away at age 13 from the mission at Yarrabah, where she lived with her family in the camp to go to boarding school in Brisbane, and the subsequent futile efforts of her mother writing to the Chief Protector to ask that Flo be allowed to come home after 6 years in Brisbane in boarding school. Her mother never got a response. Auntie Leslie told the inquiry of the efforts that her parents had to go to get married, of how her father had to prove he was of good character, free of disease, thrifty with money and capable of maintaining a wife. This was of a man who had enlisted in the Australian Army during the Second World War. That merely improved his chances of being given permission to marry. We have also heard evidence this week of the effort of those under the Act to gain an exemption. David Ragg told the inquiry about his grandfather's application for an exemption in 1932 to the Queensland government. We are told his grandfather wanted to educate his family and to move to Gayndah and have his children go to school, but that application was rejected. Control by administrative processes under the Act was also apparent in Professor Bunder's evidence. We heard about her father's experience in applying for an exemption. This was granted only after he had returned from the war. Professor Bunder's evidence spoke to the level of control of the then government through the use of administrative processes under the Act, including like the account of Arnie Leslie, of the need to seek character references. Another aspect of that theme of control came through the testimony that we heard today from Mr. Aird. This has been a substantive theme of his work that he has explored in a number of exhibitions and publications, including Portraits of Our Elders, which, in his words, offers a glimpse of the transition that Aboriginal people in southern Queensland experienced through the evolving political landscape between the 1860s to the 1920s, to the transforming Tyndale exhibition, through which Mr. Aird and his collaborator Vernon Arkey told the story of those living on government reserves and under government control who were subjected to the eugenic scientific processes of Norman Tyndale and John Birdsdale, and the reclaiming of those images by their descendants. Members, the evidence that I have given an overview of this afternoon is all part of this inquiry's overarching investigation of the ongoing systemic impacts on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the past practices of the colonial and state government. The evidence you have heard of those impacts has been powerful and at times heart-wrenching. This afternoon, Auntie Flo told us of her mother's experience of removal, massacres, and life on the mission, and how it affected the way in which she parented. Auntie Flo remembered coming home from school, laughing with friends, only to be scolded by her mum. Her mum told her that on the day she was taken away from Palmer River, she had been laughing and having fun. That memory of being taken was so horrendous, Flo's mum couldn't stand to let Flo laugh or sing. Another aspect of these systemic impacts has been the accessibility and standards of education to which First Nations people could aspire. For example, Professor Bunda told us that she received the bare minimum standard of education and that people did not come off the mission very literate. But you heard the evidence that her parents knew of the importance of literacy and taught themselves through cryptic crosswords. We also heard that her parents did so that her children could have a good education. That one account is one of many that are illustrative of the resilience in the face of adversity of the participants who have come to speak to the inquiry this week. David Ragg's evidence spoke of the example of his parents, grandparents, and community, of the importance of treating everyone with the dignity and respect, of the spirit of goodwill that they fostered, in his words, even with the bad stuff that happened to them and their parents, including being sent to Cherbourg. We heard evidence from Auntie Flo about her work and focus on reconciliation and engaging with truth-telling. This is work for which she has been recognised, including as Brisbane NIDOC Elder of the Year in 2023 and as the chair of the National Sorry Day for the Stolen Generation. We have heard much evidence as well about participants' perspectives on the importance of this inquiry. As Arnie Leslie told you on day one, it is important that we all learn about this history. In the eloquent words of Auntie Flo, the inquiry is a healing process. We don't blame and can't change our history. Many horrible things happened, but it is very important that people know our history and understand what people went through, the horrendous things, and know the truth. It is part of healing for all of us. And we have seen this week the impact that developing, storing, and sharing knowledge can have on understanding the past. Auntie Leslie, in speaking of the documentation of control over the lives of First Nation peoples, has remarked, "They did not realise how much control over our lives was documented, but this level of documentation has ultimately contributed to a better understanding of the past, which we hope to explore in the upcoming hearings of this inquiry." Looking ahead, the next 3 years are crucial for acknowledging this shared history, fostering growth, and giving a designated space for Indigenous voices in shaping the policies that address historical injustices and promote cultural revitalisation. The next 3 years are pivotal for all Queenslanders as the state embarks on a path of truth-telling about its colonial past as well as its present. This process is crucial for acknowledging the injustices that have been faced and are faced by First Nations communities, including the violence, displacement, and erosion of culture that occurred post-colonisation. But truth-telling is not just about confronting the past, it is also about fostering healing and reconciliation in the present. As we have heard from you, Chair, this inquiry will shine a light onto individual stories so that the inquiry can examine the systemic and ongoing impact of past conduct, in order to pave the way for a future built on respect, justice, and a genuine partnership. The inquiry's work aims to lay the foundation for meaningful change, strengthening relationships, and empowering communities. One of this inquiry's aims is to empower all Queenslanders to engage in our processes and to come forward and tell their stories, ensuring that future generations understand the significance of First Nations culture and history so that we as a community can move forward as a united whole. On that note, I may turn to my fellow council assisting, Ms. Ben.
Thank you, Ms. Longbottom. As has been said many times this week, the Truth-Telling and Healing Inquiry is a historic opportunity to complete the full picture of Queensland's history, a balanced history. Truth-telling unites people, and as Auntie Leslie Williams explained it in her way on Wednesday, a lot of white fellas have been on this journey with us. We are on this journey together. The inquiry recognises for truth-telling to be a way of healing, it needs to be safe and accessible. This week, the inquiry demonstrated that it can create a truth-telling experience that is safe and accessible, even in more formal settings like the one that has been this week. The inquiry put into action a culturally responsive, trauma-aware and healing-informed approach in recognition that truth-telling process can not only be difficult, but it can be distressing. We saw this demonstrated by being flexible in the design in which the hearing space for participants was, by centering each participant in the truth-telling process, the building of relationships of trust with each participant, empowering participants by creating real choices about whether and how to engage in the truth-telling process, the respect for cultural protocols, and the social and emotional wellbeing supports that were made available to participants and other people who were attending the hearings. And we thank you, Leanne, Joseph and Jared from Big Hill and Oyster for being here this week and offering that culturally responsive support. Some participants, Auntie Ruth and Jackie Huggins, gave evidence by way of a video recording. And it is to be reiterated that all of this evidence is to be considered by the inquiry. Options for giving evidence to the inquiry, again, include written or video submissions, participating in truth-telling sessions, which might look like a group session, and participating in the truth-telling hearings in a formal setting like this week. If you would like to know more about the inquiry and how to get involved, please speak to an inquiry member of the staff before you leave today. You can also email or call the inquiry. The details of that are on the website, and there are also business cards on the tables outside for you to take before you go. The inquiry will be holding truth-telling sessions and hearings all over Queensland over the next 3 years, and we want to hear from you as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also from non-Indigenous Queenslanders. We want to listen, and we want to listen in the stories in the way that you want to tell them. As Professor Tracy Bunder said earlier this week, for those in the audience who are thinking about, or maybe whether they should or shouldn't give evidence, this mob will look after you. And you should give evidence, not for yourself, but for the generations who have not been born yet. They need to know who they are and where they come from. This first Brisbane truth-telling hearing was to introduce and to build trust in the truth-telling process. The hearing aimed to encourage others to share their stories and contribute to a detailed, balanced account of the colonisation of Queensland and its past and ongoing impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This week, the inquiry has shown that we will meet people where they are, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, and we will gently assist you to tell your truth, and I encourage all Queenslanders to join the inquiry on this important journey. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Ben and Ms Longbottom. I again want to acknowledge, on behalf of all the members, our gratitude for the participants who came forward this week to share their evidence. Now, turning to next week and the next steps of the inquiry. On Tuesday next week, the inquiry will sit actually just down from here in rooms B1 and 2 in a government session, a truth-telling session. On that day, we will have Director Generals, Acting Director Generals and the Police Commissioner come and give evidence from the following departments: the Department of Premiers and Cabinet, Department of Resources, Queensland Police Services, Department of Justice and Attorney General, Department of Treaty, Department of Housing, Local Government Planning and Public Works, Department of Child Safety, Seniors and Disability Services and Queensland Health. That will commence on Tuesday at 9:30 here. And again, it is open to the public. Our process ordinarily is that truth-telling sessions will not be live streamed, but will be uploaded on the website in due course. I think that concludes our first and really historic truth-telling hearing this week in Brisbane, and I extend my gratitude to all of those who have come in person to listen to the evidence this week. So thank you. Thank you.